Russia continues its assault on Ukraine. In this episode, we're taking a look at the Russian military. This is Military Matters. I'm Rod Rodriguez. As of this recording, Russian forces are closing in on the Ukrainian capital of Kiev. Tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians are fleeing for their lives as news reports flash over social media of hospitals and apartment buildings being targeted by Russian forces. But we're also getting a glimpse of the state of the Russian military. We're seeing abandoned Russian military vehicles with empty gas tanks, young Russian soldiers telling their captors that they thought they were part of a military exercise, not an invasion, and a miles-long convoy of Russian armored vehicles, tanks, and artillery seemingly stuck in a traffic jam, the result of what experts have concluded is the result of their own logistical failures. This is part 2 of our Future War series on Russia. Despite the fact that the war is happening in the present, it's important to reflect on recent statements from the US and Russia regarding biological, chemical, and nuclear war. As horrible as the events in Ukraine are, the fact of the matter is that this can get worse, much worse. Jack Murphy takes us into the Russian military.
This episode of Military Matters is unique in the sense that it features interviews with 2 subject matter experts about the war in Ukraine. One interview took place the day before the Russian invasion began, and the other interview was conducted just days after. First, I speak with renowned Russian military expert Mark Galeotti about President Putin's recent erratic behavior, Russia's order of battle, Russian special operations forces, and how the Russian government works with organized crime, amongst other subjects. Then I speak to national security journalist Tim Weiner, who recently wrote a book about political warfare between the United States and Russia. Tim explains what political warfare is, and we discuss how the Western world is pushing back against the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because we had these very sort of high pressure warnings that a full scale invasion was imminent and that Kiev would be surrounded and indeed sacked, I think was the word.
That's Mark Galeotti, the director of Mayak Intelligence, who's been studying Russia's politics and military since the days of the Soviet Union.
And so in this respect, what we got was something much, much more minimalist so far. But the interesting thing is that at the same time as the fact that all the Russians have done is really recognize the existing situation on the ground. I mean, they have sort of recognized as independent to pseudo-states who were anyway Russian protectorates. And they have openly put Russian forces into an area where they had been covertly putting Russian forces. So on one level, it's no big deal. I mean, yes, it is in terms of international law and such like, but in hard-nosed geopolitical terms, no big deal. But on the other hand, I mean, I was watching Putin's television address in which he was announcing this to the Russian people. And it was a quite extraordinary display of bile and vitriol about how everything was perfidious NATO's fault and that Ukraine wasn't really a country and so forth. It's hard to believe that pent-up resentment is not going to drive some kind of further actions. But the thing is, what Putin is now in is the situation he likes to be in, which is he has all the options and he has the initiative. He could use this as a base for some, again, the kind of massive invasion that we've been warned about. Though, to be honest, the road to Kiev, neither metaphorically nor literally, does not lead through the Donbass. It doesn't really give him any greater strategic options, in my opinion. He could launch some kind of more minimalist military adventure, for example, to take the rest of the Donbass region, or he could just freeze the conflict for the moment, as he has in Georgia and as he has in Moldova, on the principle that, let's be honest, the West will not maintain the same kind of focus on Ukraine and on the region long term. He can draw down a few of his forces, but still maintain a kind of massive preponderance of power in the region. and just wait and see what happens. Wait and see if there's instability in Ukraine. Wait and see if there's some new strategic opportunity to do something else. At the moment, we don't know. But in some ways, I think that's largely because I'm not convinced that Putin knows. He tends to be quite opportunistic and fast moving. When he spots an opportunity, he will seize it. But up to that point, he will decide, well, I'll just wait and see what seems to be the right thing to do.
Could you explain the current order of battle as these two forces are kind of squared off against one another, the Russian Federation and Ukraine, along with foreign war material that they've received over the last few months? And perhaps I wouldn't ask you to make a prediction, but to speak hypothetically or war game, how that might play out.
Well, the interesting thing is that the Ukrainian military has reformed astonishingly well, quite frankly, since 2014, when to all intents and purposes it collapsed. Mm-hmm. And one could actually wish that the rest of the Ukrainian state had reformed anywhere like as efficiently. But as is, in sheer terms of numbers, we're talking about, well, it's hard to be sure about the Russian force because that also includes the militias within the Donbass and so forth, some of which are of frankly very, very questionable military utility. In broad terms, we're talking about probably at the moment between 150 and 170,000 Russian troops in theater close to kickoff, whereas actually the Ukrainians, they can muster about 130,000 troops. But we have to realize that there is a huge difference in terms of particularly, Russia has absolute control of the air. Russia also has a massive preponderance in long-range firepower, everything from conventionally armed intermediate-range missiles all the way through to the very heavy-duty artillery and multiple rocket launch systems that the Russians so favor. So, the issue really is that it's not actually about manpower versus manpower. In many ways, what the Ukrainians have is the kind of army that Russia had maybe 15 years ago. There are some sort of particular new technologies that have been introduced, particularly, for example, the Javelin anti-tank missile from the United States, the NLAW shoulder-fired disposable anti-tank rocket from the UK, which gives them some degrees of defensive capability. But, if one looks at armor, if one looks at artillery, and also if one looks at all the panoply of, communication systems, detection systems, electronic warfare systems. On all of these areas, the Russians have a huge sort of strength. So basically, if they did unleash this kind of invasion that we're talking about, it will probably begin with what the Russians call a MRAO, a massed rocket and airborne strike. And by the time that had finished, and by the time the preliminary bombardments with which the Russians tend to start their offensives had finished, to be honest, there probably wouldn't be all that much of the Ukrainian army in the field. What we have to understand, though, is obviously, look, there's such a huge difference between breaking the Ukrainian military on the battlefield, which the Russians can do, taking cities, and then pacifying territory. Particularly because if we look at how the Russians have tended to approach urban warfare, whether we're talking about Grozny in Chechnya, whether we're talking about places like Aleppo in Syria, it is, to put it very bluntly, to bomb and shell it into rubble and then plant a flag on the top. I'm not convinced that politically that would be viable in the case of Ukraine, both because of the response from the West, but also actually the response from Russians, to whom the Ukrainians are basically their cousins, shall we say. It's interesting how recent opinion polls have shown that in fact Russians are much more positive towards Ukrainians than Ukrainians are towards Russians. So urban warfare would be a real challenge, and one that actually the Russians have struggled with in the past. And then above all, pacifying what is a huge country with a population in which there's, over 100,000 have been sort of given at least basic training and preparation to fight as territorial defense militias. There's a lot of guns that have been distributed. There's a lot of, again, light support weapons and so forth. And, these are not people who have been well trained by any means, but they have been trained enough to basically wait in a cellar or in a basement and just open fire with a Kalashnikov. So I think that any thought that this would be a quick, easy, and from the Russian point of view, bloodless conflict, if they really went in like that, would be a very fond, vain hope.
And from your point of view, you think politically it wouldn't be as acceptable to level Kiev the way they did in Aleppo or Grozny?
No, I mean, you think of Kiev is the cultural and religious and spiritual capital of the sort of Slav and Russian people. Kiev is where Christianity first came to the Russias. And interestingly enough, St. Vladimir, who's meant to be the patron saint of Russia, is actually St. Volodymyr of Kiev. So, I mean, I think that, yes, the thought of using the same kind of tactics that they would use, for example, in Syria, I think is unacceptable politically. And although, look, the Putin regime is an authoritarian regime, but what I think they have internalized from what happened in neighboring Belarus, when Alexander Lukashenko, the dictator of Belarus, falsified the election results on an astonishing, breathtaking, and clearly insulting scale. And that sparked what is really a sort of nationwide public protest that turned into some kind of attempt to unseat him, which has failed, but is very much going to transform the nature of the regime. I think the Kremlin is very alarmed about that. In 2024, there are the presidential elections where I think it's pretty clear that Putin will be standing. And of course, Putin will be winning. The issue is not whether they're going to rig the vote. They clearly are. But they would like to minimize the degree to which they have to rig the vote. And given that they had, in September of last year, parliamentary elections, which showed actually considerable degrees of dissolution. I mean, the real vote for Putin's party was probably in about 30%. So I think there is an awareness that even if you're an authoritarian regime, you do have to think about what your own people are going to feel about a conflict, especially when that conflict is going to mean boys coming home in zinc boxes.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on that a little bit, because the perception some of us have in America and in the West is, Vladimir Putin is a dictator and he can do whatever he wants. But if Russian soldiers start coming back home in caskets in sizable numbers, what sort of political problems does that really pose for the Russian government?
Let me start by saying that actually it's clear that the Kremlin itself is worried about the political risks. Mm-hmm. I mean, this helps explain why, for example, they continue to have attempts to deny the presence of their own forces in the Donbass region ever since 2014. Not because they think that if they lie one more time, we in the West will believe them and so say, oh, I'm awfully sorry for having misunderstood. No, of course not. It's because precisely the Russian population, although they were delighted to see Crimea return to Russia, because they regard Crimea as rightfully part of Russia, as it was until the 1950s, but also because the Crimean operation was pretty much bloodless. Donbass is rather different, and therefore, even from the very beginning, the Kremlin had to basically deny to its own people that it was involved. Likewise, if we look at Syria, I mean, at first, the Syrian intervention in 2015 was purely meant to be an air power intervention with a certain amount of, intelligence and logistics backup. It soon became clear to the commanders in Khmeimim that Syrian military was in no fit state to actually sort of basically launch ground operations. And so they needed someone to be a sort of a stiffener and a tip of the spear, someone to actually provide ground assault troops. And even then, they could not use Russian forces. So what they did is, again, they used mercenaries from Wagner Group. Now, Wagner, 98% Russian, was at the time being paid for by the Russian Defense Ministry, was being trained on a Russian Spetsnaz Special Forces base, and was flown in by Russian Air Force planes. But because they could pretend that these were not Russian forces, they were just contractors working for Damascus. When one of their guys died, there was no official funeral, there was no state pension, etc. Again, did it change our opinions about what was going on in Syria? Not at all. It was purely about trying to convince the Russians that this was just the, I won't say bloodless techno-war, bloodless as far as the Russians were concerned, techno-war that was all about drones and missiles and bombs being dropped from planes at very high altitude. Nice and safe for the Russians. So we've already got a kind of a track record in which the Kremlin has realized that it has to be concerned. And the issue is, I mean, are we going to see sort of mass protests or whatever? In and of itself, not. The big Russian fear actually goes back to, again, a historic incident that took place in the Soviet Union in a city called Novocherkassk, which was a totally every city type sort of place. There was nothing particularly special about it, except that one day, on the just an unfortunate concatenation of events, the same day that they announced an increase in food prices, the big local factory for which most people worked announced a cut in piece rate norms, in other words, a wage cut. And just that happened to provide the spark. And disgruntlement became a protest became a strike became demonstration. Local police were sent in. They refused to disperse the protesters. Local garrison refused to open fire on the protesters. Eventually, it was the KGB that went in and very bloodily put it down. But it's that sense that when you have a high buildup of latent discontent, that even if that in and of itself does not create the protest, it means that when there is something that happens, some spark, just some unfortunate event, then suddenly everything can become much, much more dramatic and much, much more dangerous. And for someone like Putin, remember, Putin was in East Germany when basically East Germany collapsed pretty much overnight. And he clearly was terrified and traumatized by the experience. I mean, there he was at one point having to try and face down a mob who were besieging the KGB building, while they were desperately trying to ring the local Soviet garrison to provide backup. And the garrison said, well, without orders from Moscow, we can't do anything, and Moscow's silent. So he saw this most Soviet, even more Soviet than the Soviet Union state collapse. Then he went back to the Soviet Union in time for the Soviet Union to collapse. This is a guy who really is traumatized by the mob, by the crowd, by people power. So I think, again, this is on the one hand, yes, he has absolute control over security apparatus and a very large and well-funded security apparatus at that. But he's never going to feel comfortable. And there's always been this attempt to try and distract and buy off and placate the Russian population. At the moment, he can't offer a better quality of life because the Russian economy is stagnant. He's tried to offer them the glories of empire, and they're clearly not impressed. He doesn't really have anything to offer them, so at least he can try and not alienate them.
I'm going to launch into a few questions here that I think are in your wheelhouse about Russian special operations forces and organized crime. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the use of Russian special operations forces in Georgia and Crimea, and how we might see some of those same tactics being used in a larger conflagration in Ukraine if that happens.
Yeah, it's interesting. If one looks at Russian special operations forces, the Spetsnaz, which is the main element, special designation it stands for, there's a risk sometimes of thinking that they're all a bit too powerful, a bit too effective, that they're somehow 10-foot tall Russian ninjas. They're not. Actually, most Spetsnaz, there's still quite a few, for example, conscripts within the Spetsnaz. Most of them, really, we ought to think of them as relatively elite light infantry intervention forces. They're more like, they say, the Rangers or the British Parachute Regiment. However, ever since 2013, the Russians have had an organization called the KSSO, which is the Special Forces Command. And that is definitely a tier 1 special forces unit. And that had its first use precisely in Crimea in 2014. And it's demonstrated itself to be highly professional. In Georgia, they hadn't had those forces. And to be honest, the Spetsnaz didn't really distinguish themselves particularly impressively. They tended to be tough fighters, but not as flexible, not as independent as we think of as special forces operators, and certainly not able to operate in the kind of small units. KSSO is different. KSSO is really much more, to be honest, I think to a large extent, they model themselves very deliberately on, on
JSOC.
Yeah, JSOC and a few others. They also, they looked at the French, they looked at how the SAS operated. But the key thing is this, there's a much closer link, even closer link, shall we say, between the Russian special forces and their military intelligence. And their military intelligence has a much more of a political operations role than we might be used to. The Russians are much, much less siloed than we are in the West. They regard intelligence, battlefield intelligence gathering, psychological warfare operations, and wider strategic political operations really as just part of one continuum. And so it's clear that their special forces operators are expected to be used in this role. So on the one hand, yes, today they may well be designating targets for airstrikes. Tomorrow they might be in civilian clothes carrying out an assassination. And the day after that, they may be involved in, for example, putting together some kind of false flag operation for wider global media consumption. So, I think this is the interesting thing, that what we can expect is precisely that, where we have these real Russian special forces operators being deployed, we can expect them to be much, much more likely to be used in the kind of operations which are for impact outside the battlefield.
So do you see the KSSO as a credible threat then, when we hear some of these press reports that they're putting together assassination lists and things like that, what we would call here in America high value target hunting, things like that, the direct action raids that we've seen during the war on terror, that's a real credible capability that they could bring to the fold potentially?
It is, though. The interesting thing, I must admit, I do have some cautions about the notion that there are sort of death lists being drawn up already. Arrest list, absolutely. But, in fairness, even the Russians, we have not seen them to use that kind of tactic. And I think in part, it reflects the fact that, and actually this is a welcome move, the United States is moving much more onto the front foot with information operations. In this case, having been very much caught off guard by the Russians in the past, they decided that they're going to seize the opportunity. And one of the issues with that is that sometimes you do need to crank the handle maybe one more turn than you would otherwise do so, because you've got to have something new to say. You can't just simply say, yeah, things are still bad. What we should realize is, again, the Russians have this huge security apparatus, particularly the Rosgvardia, the National Guard, which is not like the American National Guard. The Rosgvardia is a professional, full-time internal security force that also has a secondary external role. And if there was some kind of massive invasion, we can expect Rosgvardia, who are already in the area. We've already seen them with task force markings on their vehicles, including what are called avtozaki, which are prisoner transport vehicles. We've seen them in Belarus, for example, as part of the operations there. And Rosgvardia, exactly, these are the people who would be carrying out the kind of sort of basically operations behind the front line to, door-to-door searches, looking at who they have on a list that they have to pick up. And they also have their own special force units, which are actually often highly competent because they're anti-terrorist commando units. And I think actually, I think it would be a waste, frankly, of KSSO to be involved in this on the whole. They may well be involved in attacks which are intended to disrupt Ukrainian commander communications. So yes, it might be selected assassinations in that context.
Or sabotage operations.
But I think exactly more likely sabotage. But if we're talking about a kind of a methodical picking up of all the people who you think might be a problem to have lying around, that's very much the kind of thing that the army is not going to want to get involved with. And there are the professional thugs of the National Guard ready there to do that job.
I was wondering if you could unpack a little bit the role that you've seen, if any, that the Russian mafia and the local mafia plays in places like Crimea and Donbass, and perhaps how that could play into a wider campaign in the region.
Yeah, the Russians are very parsimonious. They really will not pass up on any particular instrument or opportunity that comes their way. And what we have seen, particularly since 2014, and we saw very much in Crimea, is the Russians, from time to time, I don't want to overplay it, but turning to organized crime as an adjunct to particularly their intelligence services activities. And we have seen this being done outside of Russia's borders. We've seen them being used for example, assassinations. There was, at the end of 2019, there was a Chechen who was seeking asylum in Germany, Chechen who had organized fights against the Russians. And he was walking through a park in Berlin, and someone went up behind him and shot him. And it turns out that this guy was actually caught, and it turned out he was a contract killer who clearly had been just simply engaged by the Federal Security Service, the FSB. But we've seen assassinations of Chechens in Turkey. We have seen intelligence gathering in Scandinavia and the Baltic states. We've seen all kinds of different activities. Now, on the whole, the intelligence services don't trust the gangsters for fairly obvious reasons. Our operational security is not exactly their middle name. But when they have a particular capability, or when, frankly, the intelligence services are overstretched, then in a way they regard them as a useful additional source. And generally speaking, they either offer them an advantage, like, well, we'll let you move stuff through the border or whatever, or often they just simply say, well, we know who you are. We could crack down on you, or you could do us this one favor and we'll go away. So, there's a variety of modalities. But in the context, that's in the context really of, shall we say, intelligence operations plus. However, if we think of it in the context of warfighting, what was striking in Crimea is that as the so-called little green men, or as the Russians call them, the polite people, these special forces with no insignia were fanning out and basically locking down the peninsula. Highly professional, very well equipped. There was also an additional force, the sort of local self-defense volunteers, who were, although now clutching shiny new weapons, nonetheless much, much less disciplined, much, much less impressive. And a lot of these, some of these were genuine supporters of wanting to join the Russian Federation. Some of them were other kind of volunteers, Cossacks, Afghan war veterans, and so forth. But, a fair chunk of them were actually members of the two main local organized crime groupings, who are normally at daggers drawn. But essentially, they had been told, well, for the moment, here is an opportunity, and you really want to be on the right side of the new regime. And they provided, well, on the one hand, they provided not very impressive, but still, additional people. But they also provided a degree of political top cover. That precisely, they allowed this fiction that what was happening was not a Russian takeover to persist longer than it otherwise would have. Then when we look at what's happened in the Donbass, a fair number of the pro-Russian militias which exist, and we've got to remember that most of the people fighting in the Donbass are actually Ukrainian citizens, even if nowadays their commanders tend to be Russians brought in from the Russian military. But there are militias which were basically local organized crime groups that just simply had an opportunity to turn their capacity to wield violence into the opportunity to just basically become, a local field commander and a warlord of your neighborhood or your town. So this is happening. But my particular concern is this: gangsters tend to be the true internationalists. States may have trouble with other states, but criminals will always cooperate if there's money in it. And for example, it's worth noting that the drug trade through Donbass into Ukraine and thence on into Europe, heroin, essentially we're talking Afghan heroin, a little bit of methamphetamine, has almost been untouched by the war. And what we're seeing is clearly Russian gangs with their local representatives in the Donbass doing deals with Ukrainian gangs without any problem. And that means, of course, that Russian organized crime is both active in Ukraine, but also has local allies and partners. And again, we've seen in a few cases, every now and then there were spates of low-level terrorist actions in Ukraine, clearly just simply intended just to drive up the local sort of tension of the population. And I said, often it's silly little things, hand grenade left in a bus shelter type stuff. But nonetheless, certainly talking to people from the SBU, the Ukrainian Security Service, their belief is that on the whole, it's not as though highly trained Russian agents were being assigned to carry out this kind of penny ante sabotage, but rather that they subcontracted it to local criminals. And therefore, there is that potential. And I know it's something that the Ukrainian government takes seriously, that again, when we're talking about sabotage, when we're talking about the kind of disruption, which certainly in the first minutes, hours, or days of any wider conflict can be so important, that organized crime may well be useful for the Russians because they'll be willing to pay well for relatively low-level actions.
Is there anything else you think people really need to know about this conflict in Ukraine and where it could potentially evolve over the next, say 4 weeks?
I think there's a couple of things really about the kind of big picture, political dimension. What's really striking is the degree to which Putin seems to be making the decisions himself as an individual. Again, we tend to obsess about Putin specifically, but in most policy cases, it's clear that he has consulted, that he listens to experts and so forth. That seems to have become much, much less of a factor in recent, years, exacerbated by COVID. I mean, he operates in this extraordinary biosecurity bubble. And generally, look, he's been in power for 20 years. This October, he's going to be 70. Most authoritarian leaders tend to become pretty much caricatures of themselves over time. But we had the example of a televised Security Council meeting in which notionally Putin was there to listen to the most powerful security-related officials in the country and their views on whether or not Russia should recognize the pseudo-states in the Donbass. And it was an extraordinary and almost embarrassing spectacle as he put people on the spot. He didn't listen to many of them. He cut them off. He expected them all. I mean, they all knew what they were meant to say. But, at one point he said, well, it seemed like we're all agreed on recognition. Does anyone disagree? And there was this mortal silence. His own foreign intelligence chief, Putin openly bullied him when he got tongue-tied and stumbled and got confused. When his prime minister tried to talk about the economic side of things, Putin was clearly not interested, drumming his fingers on the desk, and then cut him off likewise. When Dmitry Kozak, who was the main troubleshooter who'd been negotiating with the Ukrainians, again, tried to actually express his 2 kopecks on the idea, again, Putin cut him off. And so this is, I think, a big concern. We've operated on the principle that actually Putin is a rational actor, which he is. But the point is, even the most rational actor can make very dangerous and stupid decisions if he hasn't got the data or isn't being told the right data. Now, look, I did my PhD on the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. And one of the things that was clear is that a key factor was that when the Politburo and the small number of grandees who were making the decision, they were told by the defense minister that this was going to be an easy operation. 6 months and it'll be over. Yeah, exactly. Just simply, go in there, overall the locals a bit and pull out because, as we know, the Afghans are easy to overawe. The thing was, his own generals, his general staff, his chief of the general staff were all painfully aware that this would be disastrous. But the defense minister, who, although he wore a uniform with a breast full of medals, was no soldier, he was a drinking buddy of the general secretary, Brezhnev's, he sat on all of that. He refused to let the chief of the general staff address the Politburo. He refused to let any of the paperwork, which was basically saying, this is what we think is going to happen, go to the Politburo. So in that case, it was the defense minister who was sitting on it. Now, the current Russian defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, I don't think he's quite the same sort of type. But the point is, it doesn't look like Putin is interested in listening to any of that. Now, that was just one particular televised, and as I said, throughout the theatrical event. It may well be that behind the scenes, things are a lot more rational. But I think the big concern is that there are a lot of smart Russians who, when given the orders, will work out battle plans and work out the best way to disembowel Ukrainian state and whatever else, even though they clearly have qualms. There's a lot of chatter within, for example, social media groups that are frequented by Russian security types, concerns about what it would mean. But Putin doesn't go on social media. Putin doesn't seem to be listening that much. So I think this, for me, is the most alarming thing, that actually, when it comes down to it, one man who himself, after all, has no real military experience, he did a little bit of artillery reserve officer training when he was at university, but then as soon as he joined the KGB, he no longer had to continue with his reserve activities, who doesn't really understand the military, who is making decisions without even listening to those people who do. That, for me, is probably the most dangerous thing about this situation.
This sounds like it's a catastrophe for Russia if they invade. In his mind, what is he hoping to accomplish here? Is this just the fever dreams of empire?
I think there's an element. We have to realize that from Putin's point of view, he feels that he is actually defending Russia. From his point of view, Russia has a right to be considered a great power. And amongst the various things, he's very, very 19th century in his thinking. A great power has a sphere of influence, amongst other things. And Ukraine should realize that it's part of Russia's sphere of influence. And because the West isn't willing to grant Russia that status, isn't willing to basically write off these countries, then that actually is the West being aggressive against Russia. I mean, that's genuinely how he sees it. So, there he is. He's thinking that. And also, look, he's a product, as I say, of the collapse of the Soviet system, the collapse of the whole sort of, empire then. And we've just had the 30th anniversary of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And if one looks at Putin's own assessments, so much of it revolves around this notion that Mikhail Gorbachev, the last Soviet leader, the reformist leader, was weak. And it was his weakness that basically brought everything down. And he's clearly terrified of either being or, even worse yet, looking weak. So him, his regime, his country all have to look strong. And I think this is it, having first, shall we say, sort of tried to lean on Ukraine in all kinds of different ways before 2014, and then sort of generating this fake conflict, fake civil war in the southeast of Ukraine. I was living in Moscow at the time. And again, everyone assured me, 6 months, it's all going to be over. This is magic. 6 months is clearly the standard length of any conflict. Within 6 months, Kiev would have capitulated. They'll realize that they're basically part of Russia's sphere of influence and everything will be back to where it was. But the Ukrainians didn't. And I think this is the problem. It's almost like, for that reason, the Ukrainians have become such a thorn in his side, because they're a sign of failure. He still hasn't managed to defeat even the Ukrainians. And that's why he ultimately needs to, or else he will have to acknowledge that both he's made mistakes, Putin's the man who never makes mistakes, but also that this is something beyond his power. So I think there's a lot of this, it's about historical legacy, it's about self-image, but it's also, I think, actually a very raw issue of power and survival. He feels that if he has to basically back away from Ukraine, then God knows what else could follow.
Hey everyone, I'm Rod Rodriguez with a quick reminder. Go to stripes.com and use promo code podcast and you'll get 50% off your digital subscription. That's 50% off your digital subscription when you use promo code podcast. Just go to stripes.com and use promo code podcast today.
That interview concluded the day before the invasion began. So I'll ask you to forgive Mark or myself if we said something that appears to have not come to pass as we look in the rearview mirror. While I think Mark knew something was going to happen, I admit I never thought Putin would be so irrational as to invade Ukraine, as it would be so catastrophic for Russia. That much, at least, does seem to have come to pass, as we've witnessed hundreds of Russian armored vehicles being destroyed, soldiers running out of gas and abandoning their vehicles, Russian POWs bad-mouthing their commanders, and even Ukrainian civilians going for joyrides on Russian main battle tanks that they've captured. We have also seen the Western world punch back in a concerted, concentrated way that we haven't seen in decades. To understand the political warfare taking place between America and Russia and where this war is heading, I discussed the subject with national security journalist Tim Weiner. Tim is the author of Legacy of Ashes, about the history of the CIA, and is currently working on a sequel that covers the CIA in the 21st century. Tim has been a journalist for 35 years, working for the New York Times, amongst other outlets, and has reported from Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Sudan, to name a few. His most recent book is about the history of political warfare between the United States and Russia. Our interview took place a week into the war. I wanted to circle back to there was I had a conversation with Mark Galeotti, and he was pointing out that the Russians are not as siloed as we are. Like all these things like economic warfare, information warfare, outright military warfare, they all see that as the same continuum of war in the context of what we're calling political warfare here. And not to get terribly partisan, but in the previous administration, we saw sort of chaos as a leadership style, where there was more energy put into attacking NATO, in attacking alliances, economic partnerships, and so on. Now, I, in my opinion, I'm interested to hear what you think. It seems like our country is finally fighting back in a cohesive manner and leveraging a whole of government approach, again, in what we call political warfare. And from what you're describing, it sounds like you probably agree with that.
Oh, 100%. What you are seeing, you have it exactly right, is a whole of government approach to the problem of an autocrat with a very large army and a similarly powerful nuclear arsenal taking over a country. In the process, declaring that that country doesn't exist. Ukraine does not exist. Its people, including its very Jewish president, are Nazis. Those of great age or long memories will recall that the Soviets sent tanks into Budapest to crush Hungary in 1956, into Czechoslovakia to crush the Prague Spring in 1968. And the world largely watched and offered thoughts and prayers. This is different.
So as far as what's happening in Ukraine now, I mean, what do you make of what we're seeing? Because I think especially in the context of the last 6 years or so, however long, where largely the story we've been hearing is America is so far behind the disinformation game. We're so far behind the Russians and the Chinese. But what we're seeing in Ukraine right now is really fascinating, because it's like we're finally fighting back, and maybe more to the point, we're fighting through Ukraine and through the Ukrainians as a proxy.
Well, not possessing a crystal ball, and if I had one, I would be reluctant to use it. What we're probably in for is a brutal occupation in which tens of thousands of civilians will be killed, cities laid to siege, and it might not wind up looking like Warsaw in 1945, where not a stone stood upon a stone, but and it might not look like Grozny, utterly ruined, but he has the capacity to bust cities. And a sustained insurgency fought with stingers and javelins and whatever else America and the West can run into Ukraine, that will also kill thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of Russian soldiers. As with any insurgency, the Ukrainians win by not losing.
I feel like this is like night and day between when Russia went into Syria and what we're seeing today, as far as the information landscape. I mean, even the New York Times published an op-ed from Vladimir Putin during that Syria timeframe.
The information landscape is completely different because at long last, due to, if I may put in a good word for my fellow ink-stained wretches here, largely through reporting by journalists, we understand far better how the Russian state uses deception and disinformation as a weapon of war. And we further understand the power of information operations or psychological warfare, call it what you will, in shaping the battlefield. And the battlefield is the human mind, Jack. To create the will to fight, to oppose, to contest, to call out bullshit when you see it is a very powerful thing. Vladimir Putin wants to stay in power until the year 2036. He can do that if he has to run an election in 2 years.
Where do you see this situation going with Ukraine? I mean, this is a flashpoint right now. Is this presumably going to lead to, one strategic gambit leads to the next? I mean, what do you see for the future of relations between Russia and the United States?
Nothing good, Jack. I think the United States has to use every weapon of political warfare it has, again, short of sending in the Marines or launching missiles, to degrade Putin's power. And I think they will in some measure, succeed in doing that. The United States needs to do everything it can through its intelligence services and with humanitarian and indeed lethal support to help the Ukrainians kill Russian soldiers. I think that what is happening now is the most important geopolitical event since the Cold War ended. And I would include, I may get in trouble for this, 9/11, because it has literally shifted the axis of the world. We are essentially back where we were at the beginning of the Cold War now, in terms of the United States and its allies in Europe, and indeed pretty much everybody except China, India, those are important exceptions, and Syria, Eritrea, and maybe Venezuela on the same side here.
But I mean, when you look at the metrics at Russia's GDP, life expectancy, population growth, I mean, this isn't going to be quite the Cold War that it was in the 1950s, right? I mean, I don't think this thing is going to be as big or as long lasting as that was.
The present state of affairs won't end until Vladimir Putin is dead or in the dock before the International Criminal Court in The Hague. His period should end with a sentence.
This has been a dire episode, to say the least, although not without hope. Many of us, including myself, drastically overestimated the competence of the Russian military. But what we have seen in Ukraine so far is that the Russians have a profound inability to plan and execute complicated, modern military operations. The Ukrainians, with Western support, have seized the moment and stymied the Russian advance. There can be little doubt that as frustrations in Moscow grow, that the tactics used will become increasingly draconian, as the Russian military will shell cities and civilian population centers, as we've already seen in some areas. Their propaganda has already become desperate, with laughable narratives about denazifying Ukraine, and now they are spreading the false claim that America was running biological weapons labs there without any evidence. Where I previously saw a certain Russian victory in Ukraine, even if it would only leave them trying to govern a nation that hates them, we can now see a sliver of hope. Hope that Ukraine might actually pull off an impossible win. It would be the biggest military upset of the 21st century, a monumental event, in a war that is writing the future of global history. We'll keep you up to date and stand by for episode 3 in our Russia series.
This episode was written by Jack Murphy and produced by Rod Rodriguez. You can follow Military Matters on Twitter at StripesMMPod. Be sure to leave us a review on Apple Podcast and save 50% on your digital subscription at stripes.com when you use promo code PODCAST. I'm Rod Rodriguez.
I'm Jack Murphy.
And we'll see you at the next episode.